welcome to our second class tonight. We didn't scare away everybody entirely last week, so I'm gratified for that. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as we continue our series here looking at the 12 men that you selected to be your missionaries, your pastors, your leaders, your word here on earth, we just ask that we wouldn't concentrate so much on the men ultimately, but Lord, that you are the one who is the foundation of the church, of the disciples, of the apostles, of the Bible. I pray that we would be enriched by this seminar, that we would learn a little bit more to help us understand the Gospels more, and maybe to relate a little bit better to the people who encountered you. And all these things and so much more, Lord, we praise your name above all the earth. In your name, amen. Well, welcome back to our second session. I do have notes from the first session if anybody wants those, and I'll give those out in second session as well at the end. So last week, who was here and remembers the three guys we talked about? Who can do that? Philip? Thomas, there we go. Philip, Bartholomew / Nathaniel, and Thomas. So this week we are looking at Andrew, James the Lesser, and Peter. So I selected Andrew and James the Lesser because they're smaller little entries and we have to make a lot of room for Peter. It's as I said, one of my frustrations with at least looking at the 12 disciples is we don't have an even spread of information. You know, if you're writing a book and you have, 12 main characters that you're going to move in and out, you have all their characteristics well defined. You make sure you sprinkle that in all over the place. This is it. And we have like a couple of major disciples and several that are in the middle, and then a few that we know virtually nothing about. But I think we know a little bit, and we can find out a bit more this week. So we're going to start our time together tonight by looking at Andrew. Now, I learned something this week. I was kind of wondering, I pull up a lot of art to use for their intros, and I was wondering, why did that one guy have the knife last week? What's going on with the different? Apparently, in medieval art especially, they would portray the apostles with the weapons or the instruments that killed them. So I know. So for Andrew, he is clinging to his X-shaped cross, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So that solved a little mystery for me as we're going. All right. So Andrew, what do we know about him? Well, we know a few things. We know, first of all, he's Simon Peter's brother. So, it's very interesting to me that we have at least two, if not maybe a couple more pairings of siblings within the disciples. I know that it would be very interesting if my brothers and I ended up as, co-apostles together. We'd have a lot to share. I don't know why Jesus would go, well, I'm going to take those two brothers and these two brothers, but that's what he chose to do. So he is Simon Peter's brother, and as such, he was a resident of Capernaum. Although born in Bethsaida, they ended up relocating to Capernaum, and that's where, for a good portion of their life, they practiced the trade of fishing. And that's how we, in fact, encounter him. Andrew was the very first apostle called. If that comes up in your trivia night, you throw down Andrew, and according to scripture, he's the guy who comes up. In fact, Andrew was a disciple of somebody else before he was a disciple of Jesus. Who was that? John the Baptist. He followed around. We're told that he was John's disciple and then learned about Christ. And I'm sure John had absolutely no problems with this, moved over into Jesus's camp. So as he finds Jesus, he goes to his brother Peter and says, you've got to come meet this guy. We have found him. We found the Christ. So like we talked about with Philip last week, Andrew is primarily defined by bringing people to Jesus. That's really the only 3 times we see Andrew doing anything specifically in scripture. He's always bringing somebody to Christ. So first he brings Simon Peter to go meet Jesus. The second time he brings a little boy with his 5 fishes and 2 loaves, right? Not the other way around. 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Yeah. Brings him to meet Jesus. Says, here, we got this little kid. Let's steal his lunch real quick. No, that's not what he says. Hey, he said, maybe the kid volunteered and Andrew's going out and found him, brought him to Jesus. And then, of course, the Greeks that he brings to the Greeks. So that's kind of his defining characteristics of what we know about Andrew. So here's a guy who's always eager to kind of bridge that gap, to bring people over to Jesus. That's what we're supposed to do. Exactly. So we've got some scripture here. John 1:41, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. And the first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ. I imagine this day in Andrew's life was a big day because you can hear in these words anticipation. Like, we have finally found the guy we've been looking for. The guy we maybe thought we weren't ever going to see in our lifetime, that the Jews have been waiting for hundreds and if not thousands of years at this point. We finally found him. Drop everything, come meet the Christ. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? So last week we had Philip calculating the costs of this miracle. Here we see Andrew looking at this paltry little lunch that might feed one little boy and looks at the crowd and says, if we divvy this up, I don't know if you ever saw, there's a classic Jack and the Beanstalk Mickey Mouse cartoon. Does anybody see this? Yeah, you've seen it. Okay. And they're so poor and they're so broke that they get a tiny little pea and they're trying to cut it like a tiny little bean or something. They're cutting it so thin that they hold it up and they can see through it. And that's what I'm imagining this, is going through Andrew's head, that he brings this kid to Jesus, but he also sees the logical impossibility of the miracle, at least until Jesus acts. One thing to note is that Andrew, at least at one point, got to sit down with what we call the inner circle. We'll talk about the inner circle in a couple minutes. But here we see in Mark 13 that Andrew gets to sit in with the big boys. He gets to sit in with Jesus. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, which is, you don't hear that quartet so much as the triplet, asked him privately, tell us, when will these things happen and what will be the sign that they're about to be fulfilled? So Andrew, at least on one occasion, gets to kind of sit down and have more like picking Jesus's brain, more of an intimate one-on-one. Can you give us some deeper knowledge? And I don't want to really extrapolate too much from that, just to say that sometimes you got to sit at the big kids table, and that was cool. Tradition tells us that Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. Different types of crosses. There was 3 main crosses that the Romans would crucify people on. We have the one that everybody's familiar with. There's also the towel cross, which some biblical scholars thought that was the one Christ was crucified on. And then there was the X-shaped cross. They all killed you just as dead. But when Andrew saw, traditionally, he's described to have seen the cross, and he runs up to it and he grabs it and he's weeping with joy and he says, my whole life has been for the cross. I can't imagine having such faith fill you up and going, you see your death and you run up to it because you know what it represents from your past and what it represents for your future. And allegedly it took him 3 days to die on this cross. That's why they would break their legs. That's how long it would take you, days and days and days of pain. All right, that's all we have on Andrew. Here's James the Lesser and his big old club. We'll talk about that in a second. But James the Lesser is the one apostle nobody knows anything about. He's easily the most obscure apostle of the 12. We do know his name. That his name is James the Younger, or James, son of Alphaeus, or as sometimes we call him James the Lesser, because there's 2 James. And how do you always like to be compared? Like there's 2 Jeremys in the room. There's a good looking Jeremy. And then there's like who wants to be called James the Lesser? We've thought because he's called James the Younger that maybe he was a younger apostle. in studying this series and seeing what a lot of, yes, ma'am.
Where did James the Lesser, where did that come from? I mean,
Think
is that
that's
Bible
just,
or tradition or-
that's tradition. That's church shorthand for, we need to distinguish between these two guys. He's not called James the Lesser in scripture, but right. He is called James the Younger, James, son of Alphaeus. And so some scholars think he was younger, like maybe teenage younger. There are at least two apostles that possibly could have been teenagers. And remember, they didn't really have teenagers back then. Once you were 12 or 13, you were a man if you're a boy and you were working. That was your life. You didn't go to high school. You didn't go to college. And so it's not like Jesus would see a 13-year-old and say, that's a boy. He would say, that's a man. All right. So what else do we know about him? Well, very, very little. But there's a lot of speculation because if nothing else, biblical scholars and pastors love to try to fill in gaps. And so some speculate that maybe he was a half brother or a cousin of Jesus, and they have to use very roundabout reasoning to try to get there. Some people look at his name, that he's son of Alphaeus, and go, well, wait, Levi is son of Alphaeus. Does that mean Matthew and James the Lesser are brothers? Your guess, good as mine. That's just an interesting little thing. But, a lot of people can have the name Alphaeus. So, yeah, he could have been younger than the other apostle James or shorter, hence the nickname. Tradition tells us that James the Lesser was a missionary to either Syria or Persia. He has a wonderful death story that he was recalled to Jerusalem in 63 AD. And at that time, the priest there took him up to the top of the temple, shook him by the collar and said, you need to recant this Jesus Christ nonsense. And if you recant, we'll walk down, have a nice brunch. And he said, I will not recant. And they threw him off to kill him. Apparently that only broke his leg. And so they go down, and depending on which story you hear, they either took stones and crushed in his head, or they took that big club you saw and killed him. But that's the tradition. So what I also want to add for James the Lesser is this interesting thing. Out of the 12 apostles, here we have a guy whose mom is better known than he is. His mom. We actually know more about James the Lesser's mom than we do of this man. What do we know about her? Well, we know her from two different encounters in scripture, both which happened around Easter weekend. First of all, we know that in Mark 15, James the Lesser's mom was there at the crucifixion. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Younger, which is where we get that phrase from, and of Joseph. So maybe Joseph's his brother, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. So we have this group of women that had been, at least in the region of Galilee, Jesus's support team. And they had been providing financially and with food and with housing. I mean, missionaries need support, and that's what they did. So they were there for the whole ride. I can't imagine being an apostle and having your mom along for the ride, but that's what happened. So James the Younger, his mom was one of those really incredible women in the gospel. We also see Mary pop up in Luke 24 as Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them who told this, and by this we're referring to the resurrection, the empty tomb, told this to the apostles. So, and remember, the apostles didn't believe them. I imagine James the Lesser's mom had some words with him. Said, what, son? I tell you something, it's the truth. I do want to finish talking about James the Lesser with a quote from John MacArthur. He was delivering a sermon on the 12 apostles, and when he got to James the Lesser, somehow wrangled 5 entire paragraphs out of this guy we know nothing about. But he said this, and I thought this was worth sharing with you. John MacArthur said, James Mark is obscurity. And I think it's kind of neat that the Lord put in one guy in here who's utterly obscure. And he talks a bit about how it's not really us, it's Christ. We need to have one guy who's it's not about him. And MacArthur goes on and says, the only time the apostles are ever mentioned in scripture is when they intersect with Christ for a specific purpose. He is the focus. There's never a diversion. You don't have any record of the career of any disciple. And that's very true. that as we're studying the apostles, it's good to study them. It's not good to venerate them. We don't pray to the apostles. We don't ask them to be our intermediates. We don't say that there's this tier system and they're somehow between us and Jesus. We're looking at them to understand scripture better and to understand how Jesus picked his people to lead his church and had that identification with ordinary men. But we're not putting them on a pedestal, at least in a way that's unhealthy for us to do. So I thought that was very good of him to point that out. All right, now let's really chew into it here and let's talk about Simon Peter. We're going from the most obscure apostle to the one we know the most about. And Peter almost seems like he has an unfair share of how much the Bible talks about him. We have a guy who is just all over the four Gospels, all over Acts, and we know a lot about him. Oh, hey, we have somebody joining us too. That's awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Simon. Because there is so much about Simon Peter, I had to kind of pick and choose the best. So you'll have to excuse me that I'm not going line by line by I pulled out every verse, by the way, that mentioned Peter, and it was about 5 pages worth of stuff. But we'd be here for a long time. So I kind of want to just sum this up for you. First of all, Simon Peter was Andrew's brother. He was a fellow fisherman. That's how we first see him encounter with Christ, that he is a fisherman who lived in Capernaum. He was married at some point, which I find endlessly fascinating. It's not, my mental picture of the apostles are all bachelors who had no ties to family and could just up and leave and go with Jesus. And here we have indication that at least at some point he was married. Now it's possible he was married, his wife died, and by the time Jesus called him, he was a widower. But we don't know. We just know from this one passage in Mark 1:30-31 that it says Jesus healed the fever of Peter's mother-in-law. So, back then the whole family would live in the same house. So that was very common. Peter was a leader. He is seen as the leader of the 12 apostles. He's also their spokesperson, which is a lot of times when Peter's speaking, he's not just talking for himself. He's talking for all the 12 guys. He's kind of being the voice of the 12. So instead of the Bible bouncing around saying, well, James said this and Bartholomew said this and Andrew said this, usually it's just always Peter. And Peter is voicing what all the apostles are saying or feeling at the time. He's also part of what we call the inner circle. The inner circle are Peter, James, and John. So Jesus has all his disciples, which we know at one point was at least 72, if not way, way more than that. He has the 12 apostles, and then he has this inner circle. And that's actually a really interesting format for leadership, that one person as a leader can't sit down and personally one-on-one to a great extent disciple 72 people. But I can, to a lesser extent, disciple 12 people, and to a greater extent, disciple 3. And that's what the inner circle was. The inner circle was Jesus poured the most of his the most of the important moments into these 3 men, while still the other 9 had a lot to do with Jesus's journeys and his teachings. Peter is always listed first in all the rosters of the apostles, even though he was the second called. And that is the Bible's way of saying he was the most important. All right. So what are some of the highlight? Oh, wait, before I get into that. So Jesus knew from the very start, he chose from the very start, I should probably have written, that Peter was going to be the leader of the church. That when Jesus ascended to heaven, Peter was chosen to be the one to lead the church. And so Jesus has a great vested interest in training up Peter. And we know at one point, Jesus even gave him a graduation, a nickname graduation. In the Bible, anytime somebody gets a new name that's bestowed on them by somebody else midway through their life, it's a very significant moment. Jacob becomes Israel, right? We have, what are some other name graduations that you know of? Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah.
Saul becomes Paul.
Thank you. I was waiting for somebody to Saul to Paul, right? These are big graduating moments. And here, even though we're still calling him Simon or Simon Peter, Jesus gives him this nickname of Peter, Rock. which means you're going to be this rock, this firm foundation. I'm going to build the church. In fact, he says in Matthew 16, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, will not prevail against it. This is a great verse to gracefully talk about when you speak with your Mormon friends, by the way. Your Mormon friends believe in something called the great apostasy, where at some point, very early on, the church lost its way and it only regained that way when the Mormon church gave us the full truth. And so there was this middle period where the church was lost and we didn't really have the truth. And you would point to this verse and say, but Jesus said, gates of hell couldn't even prevail against the church of Christ. So the church couldn't prevail against the church. We couldn't degrade ourselves to the point where we enter into this great apostasy. Anyways. Hi, Jane Stark. How are you doing?
Good.
All right. So what do we know about his personality? I think out of all the 12 apostles, we know the most about Peter's personality because it comes out of all of his accounts. And Peter is a study in good things and bad things. I think we kind of fall into a trap when we think of Peter, when we're a little too critical of him, or maybe we ignore those and we're a little too much in praise, because he's like us. You have some good qualities, you have some not so good qualities. And Peter's, I would easily say, if I was writing him as a character in a book, that he is impetuous, he's headstrong, he is unreliable, and he's very enthusiastic. And this is a very interesting mix for a person. It's a guy who, when he encounters Jesus, he's like, that's the guy I'm going to follow. I am all in on Jesus. And from that point on, that's what Peter is. He's all in on Jesus. He's super enthusiastic about following Jesus. It's like one of those guys, I don't know if you've ever encountered them, very charismatic. And sometimes they're just leading with their emotions more than their intellect. And sometimes their mouth is talking before their brain catches up. This is Peter, like to a T. This is his personality. Like he's just like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go, Jesus. You know, what do you want to do today? But at the same time, he's a little faulty. His faith hasn't quite caught up with his enthusiasm when we first meet. His faith is still down here. But by the time we last see Peter, his faith is immense. So Jesus is taking him on a faith journey. And that's one of the reasons we like Peter, is because we see a guy who starts in, God calls him not when he's perfect. God calls him not when he's the best trained person in the world for the task, but God calls him and says, are you willing? And he's like, I'm on board. And Jesus takes him, he trains him, he puts him in situations. Peter fails. Jesus picks him back up, says, get back on the path, and eventually has created a mature, deep Christian. And that is just a template for our spiritual journey, I think. Many of Peter's accounts involve success followed almost instantly by failure, which, should be the other way around. If it was a movie, you fail a little bit and then you're successful. Peter often is super successful. And then he just sticks his foot in his mouth or he does the wrong thing. A few instances we see this especially are when he walks on water. He makes it out of the boat. He makes a few steps. I don't know how many of us have walked on water, but Peter said, I got more steps than you got. Like he was successful to a point. He was enthusiastic and he had faith to a point, but then he immediately failed. So there's that falling back. Or when he declares Jesus the Christ, and Jesus is like, blessed are you. And he goes on, and then Peter almost immediately turns around and rebukes Jesus. And we'll talk about that in a second. So success followed by failure, or of course, Jesus's arrest. I'll be with you every step of the way, Jesus. I'm there with you. I've got my sword. I'm going to fight for you. I'm there to the bitter end. And he denies Jesus 3 times. And so I don't know what you want to take away from that. I find it very humanizing of going, this isn't a Hollywood story. This is a story of a guy who's sometimes successful and then sometimes just shoots himself right in the foot right after that. We also know from scriptures that Satan especially wanted to take down Peter. And just as much as Jesus identified Peter as the person he was going to have lead his church, Satan's like, that's my number one guy after Jesus, because of course Satan attacks Jesus a lot. I want to take down Peter. And so we see two instances where Satan specifically attacks Peter. The first is at the Caesarea Philippi confession, when Jesus says, okay, great, you've confessed that I'm Christ. We're going to go to Jerusalem now, and I'm going to die. And Peter says, forbid it, Lord. How dare you? We're not doing that. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. He realizes Satan has infiltrated Peter's heart, that he's tempting Peter to actually present the same sort of temptation that the devil presented to Jesus in the desert, which is a shortcut around the cross. And Jesus says, I got to go to the cross, and you can't stand, you get behind me, Peter, because Satan's sitting on your shoulder right now. And we find out later in the gospel when Peter and Jesus are talking, Peter says, I will never betray you. I'll be with you to the bitter end. And Jesus says, oh, you're going to betray me. You're going to totally fall away. He says, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. He has come to the Father. He's come to God. It says, can I have Peter? Can I have him? And God says, no, you may not. So we see Satan's gunning for him, but I also find it really funny that Satan, funny in a, I don't know, ironic, I don't know what sense that Satan has to ask God for permission, but it shows you how really weak Satan is compared to God. All right, so let's look at some highlights of Peter's life, the big stories, not every tiny little story, but all the big stories. All right, first of all, we have when it's calling the miracle of the big catch, when Jesus first encounters them and they spend all night trying to catch fish because, of course, you go out at nighttime, the fish are biting more then, it's cooler, and they haven't caught anything. So Jesus says, go back out, throw your nets again. Peter's like, I'm really tired. I'm not going to do that. Jesus says, just trust me, do it. And he goes out, throws it, and they haul in so many fish that the nets start breaking. And so at that point, Peter prostrates himself before Jesus and says, I'm not worthy. He identifies the holiness of Jesus. We see, of course, as we talked about, that when Jesus comes and walks in water toward the boat, when they're out in the Sea of Galilee, that Peter says, Jesus, if that's you, call me out to you and I'll go to you. And Jesus says, yeah, come on out. Sure. We'll see how this goes. And he gets out and he does a few steps on water, but his faith falters. And Jesus has to drag him up and say, you of little faith, and put him back on the boat. So big moment in his life. Of course, the Caesarea Philippi confession, where Peter says, you are the Messiah. Jesus, I'm sorry, back up. Jesus says, well, what do other people say I am? Some people say you're Elijah. Some people say you're this or that. And Jesus says, who do you say I am? And Peter, speaking for all the apostles at this point, says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and makes this incredible confession of faith. He also got to witness the transfiguration. And we saw a little bit of that trademark Peter blabbing without using his brain, where he's like, he sees Moses and Elijah and Jesus in his full glory. And he goes, should I build some shelters for you guys or what? And Jesus, just sit down, son. I don't know what he said to him. It's just I'm sure Jesus just like found Peter really funny at times. We also, in John 13, big part of his life, and I'm sure learning how to be a servant leader, was when Jesus was washing all the feet of the disciples, gets over to Peter, and Peter takes his feet away. He's like, you're not washing my feet. You're God. You can't wash my feet. And Jesus says what? He says, if I don't wash your feet, you can't have any part of me. And so Peter, going overboard, says, then wash the rest of me, right? And just like, that's not the point, Peter. This is not a hygiene class. This is about servanthood. And anyways, but that was a big memorable moment in his life. Also, we see Peter really having a lot of strong moments around the crucifixion and the resurrection. Of course, when Jesus, before Jesus is arrested, Jesus takes his apostles into the garden and then says, stay put, goes a little way, brings his inner circle with him. So Peter, James, and John go with him. And he says, can you guys, I'm going through a lot right now. Stay awake for me. Pray for me. And they, of course, right away. So there's an instance of Peter failing him. Jesus is arrested, and Peter, impetuous as always, acting without thinking, takes his sword out and slices off the poor ear of some servant guy, Malchus, something like that. And Jesus, of course, does a little emergency first aid and does the miracle, puts his ear back on. But, out of all the apostles, I think that's the only time we've heard, other than when Jesus says, talking a little bit about going on mission trips and swords. It's the only time we've seen an apostle with a weapon, is at this point. And he cuts off the servant's ear and then runs away with the rest of the disciples. And even though he said, even if every other apostle falls away, Jesus, on account of you, I never will. And Jesus says, before the rooster crows, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. And that night, the first night of his arrest, he's asked, do you know this Jesus? And he denies it. Do you know this Jesus? He denies it. You know this Jesus? He swears, no, I tell you, I've never met the man. And the crow caws. And he, of course, runs away. Deep shame, having betrayed his Lord. He is also seen as, so he spends a weekend in a locked room. He sees the empty tomb when he's told by the women that it is empty. He runs there, sees the empty tomb, doesn't know what to make of it, sees the resurrected Christ after that. And then at the end of John, we have this interesting little fishing trip. And this little fishing trip, it's almost a very quiet way to end John, where it's just a few of the apostles, and they're fishing with Jesus, they're fishing. They come back to the shore. Jesus is there. They cook him some fish. At that time, Jesus and Peter have a heart-to-heart. And here, this whole process, Peter is just probably beating himself up. He's probably as emotionally low as he's ever been. That not only did he betray his Lord died. Now his Lord is back. And where do they stand between them? What is that relationship? If you deny Christ, is there ever a way back? And at that point, Christ restores him. And he says this, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. He says it 3 times to really hammer that in a little bit. Feed my lambs. You got to be a pastor. I'm going to take off. I'm going to go back to heaven. And while I'm there, you will be the over shepherd of the church. You will have to take care of my sheep. You guys are not my sheep. You guys are Jesus's sheep. I'm just an under shepherd taking care of you guys. And Peter was the under shepherd taking care of the church of Jerusalem. And so he gets not only restored by Christ, but Christ says, now you got a mission. Now you can do it. And Peter had to have learned so much through that experience. That this is the forgiveness. This is the grace of Jesus Christ. And he carries with him. And after that point, Peter goes from being sand to being a rock. This immense transformation we see between the Gospels and Acts is incredible. And Peter, for the first half of Acts, is a dominant force for the early church. Of course, the story of Acts, the book of Acts, is not about Peter. It's not even about Paul. It's the Holy Spirit. That's the focal point of Acts. But Peter, in subservience to the Holy Spirit, is a major force throughout that entire book. So in Acts, and I just have to sum this up because he is just all over the place in the first half here. He delivers 2 major public sermons. He is arrested multiple times. We have 2 healings, 2 miracles that he performs. He heals the lame man. He also raises, I think it's Tabitha from the dead. And he also goes in front of the Sanhedrin and testifies for Jesus Christ. This formerly impetuous, unreliable, talking without thinking guy is now saying the most loquacious, deep, theologically sound things ever. People are amazed at him. And this is my favorite verse when it comes to the growth of Peter and how we see this transformation. Acts 4:13, it says, when they saw the courage of Peter and John, and they realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. They looked at these and they've had no formal training. I'll back up a little bit. If you were a super smart little kid, all little Jewish kids had to go through some sort of elementary school, and they learned a lot about the Bible, and they memorized the Psalms. But at a certain age, they were old enough to work, and the only people who went on to higher education were the smartest of the smartest of the smart kids. And the rabbis would pick them and go, yeah, I want to take that kid under my wing. So obviously, all the 12 people that Jesus called were not the smartest of the smartest of the smart people, because they were adults working other jobs. And so Peter is unschooled and he is ordinary. There's nothing to distinguish him from all these other people except for one factor, which is he's been with Jesus. And so they made this connection going, it's not Peter's charisma, it's not Peter's intelligence, it's not Peter's power. It's something to do with this Jesus that came into his life and has transformed him. That's made him this extraordinary. And that is always true for all Christians everywhere. That's what Christ does in our lives. All right. We also see in Acts, pretty much his last thing that he does in Acts before Acts kind of passes the baton over to Paul. And Paul really runs away with the rest of the story of Acts. But before we write out Peter here, he does have a couple last things that have to do with the structure of the church, that he receives a vision from God. Because the early church was really divided on the issue of all the Gentiles, saying, well, we have no problem converting Jews to become Christians. You know, it's so deeply ingrained in their heads as Jews that we're set apart, we're holy, they're unclean. The Gentiles are unclean, they're not welcome. If they want to come into Judaism, they have to go through very elaborate rituals, and they have to purify themselves, and they have to become Jews. And Peter receives a vision from God saying, no, now all things are okay, all people are okay in the church. He's just kind of this seafood metaphor with the net. And Peter says to the other apostles and Christians, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. There's a measure of humility in this too, that Peter, who's been brought up a certain way, has had this deeply ingrained in his head. Yet when God goes to him and says, no, Peter, this is how you act. This is how you think. This is how I want you to lead the church. He bows his head to God and says, okay. He doesn't dig his heels in and go, no way, I'm out of here. I'm not doing this if they're going to bring the Jeremy Coopers and the Jan Elders of the world into this. I'm not doing that. You know, he says, okay. But it becomes a continued issue, and he actually helps lead a council in Jerusalem, and all of Acts 15 deals with this, where they go, well, okay, we'll let the Jews, the Gentiles in, but how do we deal with that? Because everybody had different ideas. Like, do we make them obey all the Jewish laws just as stringently as we had to? Should they get circumcised? You know, all these different questions. So Peter really leads this council and helps them hash this out. And that is pretty much the last time we see Peter in the narrative of the Bible. However, that's not all that we know of him, because, of course, Peter is all over the fingerprints of Scripture as an author of Scripture. We talked about this when we went through the Gospel of Mark, that John Mark was a disciple of Peter. He studied under Peter. He was with Peter a lot. So when John Mark sat down to write the Gospel of Mark, we make a very, I think, not too far a leap here to say that John Mark's gospel draws a lot from Peter's teachings, from his personal accounts. But I don't want to say that was Peter's, it's just inspired by, and John Mark pulled that. We do know that Peter, of course, wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. Always really easy questions I had on my Bible tests. Who wrote 1st and 2nd? They're right there in the name. Sometimes Bible books are a little tricky. They'll have a name there, but we don't really know. It's just the best guess. But these two books, the only two books directly written by Peter, are given to us, and they are tremendous books. They're books about suffering, about Christian growth, about the church. I want to go through them at some point with the congregation, but he is definitely an author of Scripture, and it's kind of a refreshing change. If you've gotten so much into Paul and John, and those two authors take up a huge portion of the New Testament, sometimes you want to change a pace and you go, hey, Peter wrote 2 books. Let's go over and study from Peter for a little bit. Tradition tells us, and a pretty strong tradition at that finally Peter, after all his arrests, was arrested. He was tortured and sentenced by the Emperor Nero, who was at that point persecuting Christians right and left. He was sentenced to be crucified. And tradition tells us that Peter asked to be crucified upside down so that he would not be killed in the same manner as his Lord. We do know he was crucified. that is 100% for fact. In fact, we know that from scripture too, because in John 21, Jesus says to him, when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And so here we have a man who, when somebody just accused him of knowing Jesus, he felt a little bit of danger, ran away. And now, at the end of his life, he is such a mature Christian, he goes to the cross. And that ends our kind of very brief, very quick overview of Peter. But Peter is, of course, just a huge dominant force in the New Testament, and just I think always a very fascinating guy, because we do kind of get an arc. We don't really get that with many of them. All right, any thoughts on James the Lesser, Andrew, and Peter? What are your favorite Peter moments?
I thought it was interesting, and some scholars discuss the fact that Peter's betrayal of Christ was to stand as Jesus'
Yes.
and but Peter repented.
Yes,
Peter repented. And Judas could have repented.
he could have. And we will definitely talk about that when we get to Judas. But that's a great point. Yes, his betrayal. And that is also came into play because there were a lot of Christians around the time of the persecution that when people came to their house says, we're going to kill you if you're a Christian. Are you a Christian? They said, no. And they denied Christ. And I forget the term for them, but there's this term for Christians who kind of fell away, who denounced Christ, but later came back to the church and said, we sinned and we shouldn't have done that. Can we be restored? And the church examined scripture and went, if Peter can be restored, you can be restored. But there were a lot of Christians who, of course, stood firm in their faith and became martyrs at that time. St. Andrew became the national patron saint, according to the Catholic Church, of what country? Scotland. There you go. I don't know where Peter went or anything. That just popped up in my studies today. So, do you know why? I don't. They just kind of. I know he's in a lot of the churches. There's a lot of St. Andrews, and yeah, it's always interesting what churches choose to name themselves after. And you know, we of course get a great reformer here at Knox. All right, any other thoughts on these or questions? Probably impossible questions, but I can always. I always have questions, but yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we're gonna know these people. We're not just characters.
Right.
Yeah.
How fascinating will that be?
Yeah.
And heaven says they have a special place there, that they'll have the 12 thrones. And I called my brother. I said, well, if there's 12 thrones and Judas is obviously not on one of them, who gets that 13th spot? Is it Paul? Is it Matthias? And my brother kind of weaseled out of that question. He's like, well, I don't know if you really want to take it very literally. That's just 12 thrones. And I went, but I need to know, because there's this, like, he says, that's probably not the point of that passage, but you're right. It'll be really cool. I want to go meet James the Less someday and say, I want to hear your story. I want to hear your account of going around with Jesus. So, all right. Well, I hope this kind of enlightened a few things, and you probably heard a lot of stories and accounts you heard before, but sometimes putting them together and organizing helps us see a bigger picture we don't normally see. All right, let's end our time and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for Peter. Thank you for Andrew. Thank you for James. I just praise your name that these three men, when called by you, were bold enough, maybe impetuous, but they were bold to stand up and on faith say, I will follow you. I will go. I will proclaim your name. And Lord, these three men that went to their deaths for you, that became the martyrs of the early church, that they were so eager to share the word, they just did not worry about their own lives more than they worried about wanting to make sure that as many lives heard the gospel and were saved as possible. And I just pray that you would work in our lives to make us just that bold, just that strong for you, to want to share the word, to get it out, to want to further the kingdom, that, Lord, even if it came to our own lives, that we would be willing to put those on the line for you. But more than just our lives, Lord, our reputations, our comfort. There's a lot of things that we sometimes are very unwilling to sacrifice. But Lord, I just pray that you bolster our faith, make us into the same apostle or same disciples that you did with these 12 men. Please continue to be with our series as we look through the remaining 6 over the next 2 weeks. And Lord, just know that we love you. And we're just so grateful that you've given us the scriptures to get to know you and how you've worked in these people. In your name, amen.